A river that defined your world can simply disappear overnight. We are exploring 34 river rewiring events that completely flipped global trade corridors. By the end, you will understand exactly how the Earth's raw power has repeatedly reshaped the fate of civilizations. We will see how a single flood could strand a mighty port miles inland, and how a slow geological uplift toppled an empire. What does the ghost of a harbor tell us about our own cities today? The power to erase a river does not come from a single source. It is a collaboration of colossal forces, each capable of rewriting the landscape on a whim. Geological uplift acts like a slow, irresistible hand. As tectonic plates shift and grind, they can push entire sections of the crust upwards, creating a new mountain range or a vast plateau where none existed before. A river flowing peacefully across this land suddenly finds its path blocked by a wall of rising rock. It has no choice but to abandon its ancient course and seek a new way to the sea. This process can take centuries, but its finality is absolute. Then there is the sheer violence of water itself. Catastrophic floods, born from the collapse of glacial ice dams or from rains that fall for 40 days and 40 nights, possess an unimaginable energy. They do not follow the river's existing path. Instead, they tear across the countryside, scouring out deep, raw canyons in a matter of days, sometimes hours. The old riverbed is left high and dry, a ghost of its former self, while a torrent of water now rages through a brand new channel it carved itself. A third, more insidious force is sedimentation. Imagine a river carrying countless grains of sand and silt, year after year, century after century. As it approaches the ocean, it slows down and drops this immense load, building a vast delta. But that very act of creation can become its own prison. The river can eventually clog its own mouth with so much sediment that the water has to back up and spill over its banks, finding a weaker, lower path to the sea. This is not a slow evolution. Geologists describe these events as the planet hitting a reset button on its own plumbing. The consequences for humanity are instantaneous. A bustling port city, once a hub of global trade, can find its life-giving channel sealed shut, its ships stranded miles from the water. In the same moment, a sleepy inland village might wake up to find a new river at its doorstep, a sudden and unasked-for highway to untold wealth. The stories of these upheavals are written in the silent stones of forgotten harbors and the sudden rise of new empires. The Sarasvati River was once a titan of the ancient world. Its waters, celebrated in hymns as mighty and unconquerable, carved a fertile green belt through what is now a vast desert. This river was the central artery of the Indus Valley Civilization, supporting sprawling, sophisticated cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These were not simple villages but metropolises with planned streets, advanced drainage and bustling markets, all sustained by the predictable, life-giving flow of the Sarasvati. Its course defined the region's primary trade corridors, with goods flowing from the interior to harbors like Lothal, a vibrant port that connected this civilization to the wider world. Then the river began to die. The cause was not a single cataclysm but a slow, relentless squeeze. Far to the north, the Himalayan mountains were still rising, a process of tectonic uplift that subtly but decisively altered the entire landscape. This geological shift, combined with a change in monsoon patterns, caused the Sarasvati's main tributaries to be stolen. Adjacent river systems, like the powerful Ganges and its neighbors, essentially captured the water that once fed the Sarasvati. The mighty perennial river shrank to a seasonal stream, its flow fading with each passing decade until all that remained was dust and memory. The collapse of the river meant the immediate collapse of the civilization it supported. The trade corridors that moved timber, grain, and precious stones simply evaporated. Without water for irrigation or transport, the great cities were abandoned. The people were forced into a mass migration eastward, scattering into smaller, simpler settlements. And at the coast, the harbor of Lothal suffered the most poetic and devastating fate. The docks that once welcomed ocean-going ships were left high and dry, stranded miles from the new shoreline, a silent stone ghost watching over a dead sea. This was not merely a change in the weather, it was a rewiring of the planet's plumbing that toppled an entire world. While the slow death of the Sarasvati unfolded over centuries, other rivers rewrite the map in a single, violent season. The Yellow River of China is a dragon in every sense of the word. For millennia, it has carried an unimaginable load of fine, yellow silt, sediment that gives the river both its name and its notoriously unpredictable character. Over centuries, this silt would settle, relentlessly building up the riverbed. Engineers fought back with immense dikes, walls of earth meant to contain the rising waters. But this created a terrifying paradox. With each flood season, more silt was deposited, raising the riverbed even higher. Soon, the Yellow River was flowing on a raised ribbon of land, a suspended aqueduct towering over the farms and cities of the North China Plain. By the 1850s, the river was a disaster waiting to happen, a dragon held back by increasingly fragile chains. The Great Breach came in 1855. After a period of exceptionally heavy rains, the saturated dikes could hold no longer. The river exploded through its confines, unleashing a wall of water and mud across the flat plains. It did not merely flood, it performed a complete self-amputation, abandoning its southern course that for centuries had emptied into the Yellow Sea. With unstoppable force, it carved a brand new channel, rampaging northwards for hundreds of miles until it finally found a new outlet in the Bohai Sea. The immediate human cost was staggering, with thousands of square miles submerged and countless lives lost. But the economic and logistical shockwave was just as profound. The new northern path of the Yellow River sliced directly through the Grand Canal, the artificial river that was the empire's primary north-south trade artery. For 1,000 years, this canal had moved grain, salt, and silk, binding the empire together and feeding the capital. In a matter of weeks, the river dragon severed this vital spine. Barges were left stranded in suddenly dry canal beds, and a trade network that had sustained dynasties was rendered useless. Meanwhile, at the new river mouth, the dragon continued its work. The same immense load of silt that had raised the riverbed now began piling up at the new delta, creating vast, shallow, and constantly shifting sandbars. Deep draft trading ships could no longer approach the coast. Thriving ports that had served the old river mouth were left dozens of miles inland, their harbors becoming fields, their economies erased almost overnight. The river had not just changed its course, it had remade the entire economic geography of a region, proving that even the greatest human engineering could be undone by the raw power of earth and water. The dragon of the Yellow River showed us how quickly a trade empire could fall, but some rivers move with a patience that is just as deadly. In Italy, the Po River has been writing its own epic across the plains, a slow-motion drama of creation and abandonment that unfolded over centuries. The story begins high in the Alps, where lush forests once held the mountain soil firmly in place. But as the medieval period progressed, widespread deforestation for timber and agriculture stripped these slopes bare. Without the tree roots to anchor it, rainwater began washing unprecedented amounts of soil and rock into the river's tributaries. The Po, already heavy with its natural sediment load, was now gorged with silt, carrying this immense cargo down to its mouth on the Adriatic Sea. There at the delta, the river performed its ancient ritual of construction, dumping its load of sand and mud and steadily pushing the coastline farther and farther out to sea. This relentless forward march, known as progradation, was dramatically accelerating. For the Roman ports that depended on the Po's southern branches, this was a death sentence delivered 1 grain of sand at a time. Cities like Spina, and later the mighty naval base of Ravenna, watched in dismay as the sea retreated from their walls. The waterways that had once floated imperial warships and merchant galleys slowly filled with silt, becoming impassable, then becoming marshland, and finally transforming into the rich, fertile farmland you can see today. Ravenna, a capital of the Western Roman Empire and a seat of immense power, was left stranded, its famous harbor now a field of crops miles from the water's edge. As the southern distributaries choked on their own sediment, the Po's main channel shifted its allegiance northward. This single, gradual change in the river's path flipped the entire economic map of the Adriatic. The trade corridors that had once terminated at Ravenna now reached toward a cluster of islands in a protected lagoon. There, the city of Venice, with meticulous and brilliant water management, ensured its channels remained open and deep. It positioned itself perfectly at the new mouth of Mediterranean trade, becoming the undisputed queen of the Adriatic. The slow, meandering path of a single river did not just strand a harbor. It drained the power from one great city and poured it directly into the foundations of another, proving that a river's whim could truly make or break a maritime republic. The struggle between river and engineer continues today, and its front line is a concrete structure in Louisiana known as the Old River Control Complex. Here, the United States Army Corps of Engineers is fighting a silent, desperate war to prevent the Mississippi River from performing its next great act of betrayal. The river's current path to the Gulf of Mexico is a long, looping journey, but a much steeper, shorter escape route beckons. The Atchafalaya River offers a 30% grade advantage, a gravitational siren call that the Mississippi has been trying to answer for over a century. The core monumental dam and control system is the only thing holding it back, a choke point forcing 70% of the flow to remain in the old channel. This is not a battle against a seasonal flood, but against the fundamental physics of water itself. The river wants to jump its banks, and we have built a cage to keep it in place. The stakes of this modern saga are almost beyond comprehension. If the control structure were to fail, if the Mississippi River were to complete its capture of the Atchafalaya, the change would not be gradual. It would be a switch flipped overnight. The mighty Mississippi would surge down the Atchafalaya's channel, scouring it deeper and wider in a matter of days. The consequences for global trade would be instantaneous and catastrophic. The ports of Baton Rouge and New Orleans, which today form one of the largest port complexes in the world, would be left stranded on a tidal creek. The deep water shipping lanes that guide massive container ships and oil tankers would become a muddy, impassable trickle. The intricate web of pipelines and infrastructure built along the river's current course would be left high and dry, a billion-dollar network rendered useless in a geological heartbeat. This is the haunting reality of river rewiring in the modern age. We have not tamed the forces that toppled the Indus Valley or shifted the Po. We have only temporarily constrained them, building our most vital economic corridors on a landscape that is actively trying to change its mind. The ongoing struggle at the old river is a stark reminder that the same planetary plumbing that built and broke ancient empires is still very much alive, waiting just beneath the concrete for its next chance to rewrite the map. Even the Roman legions, masters of road and fortress, could not command a river to obey. Their northern frontier in Germania was defined by the lower Rhine, a natural moat patrolled by swift galleys and watched from a line of wooden forts known as the Limes Germanicus. This river was more than a border. It was a carefully managed supply line, a barrier against tribal incursions, and the absolute limit of imperial power. For decades, the system held, a testament to Roman order imposed upon a wild landscape. Then, in the 1st century, the river itself staged a rebellion. A colossal flood, born from melting alpine snows and relentless rains, tore through the delta. In its wake, it left a new hydrological reality. A major branch of the Rhine, the Wall, had captured a far greater share of the main river's flow. Overnight, the Wall swelled in power and depth, becoming the primary artery, while the old main channel, the one the Romans had so carefully fortified, began to slowly dwindle in significance. The consequences for the empire were both logistical and deeply strategic. The forts and watchtowers that lined the original Rhine, once bustling hubs of military activity, now guarded a backwater. Their strategic value plummeted as the new, vibrant economic life of the region shifted to follow the mighty Wall. Trade barges that had once supplied the legions now found a more efficient path elsewhere, leaving some Roman garrisons isolated on a river that was no longer the main road. This was not an invasion that could be met with a shield wall. It was a silent, unstoppable shift in the very ground beneath their feet, forcing the empire's meticulous planners to scramble, reassessing supply routes and the purpose of their entire frontier defense. The Rhine had redrawn the map, and Rome had no choice but to follow. The same geological restlessness that challenged Rome also reshaped an entire subcontinent with a single shudder. In the sprawling Bengal Delta, the Jamuna River now carries a torrent of water, but its dominance is a relatively recent and violent acquisition. For centuries before the late 1700s, the mighty Brahmaputra River took a different path, flowing further east to join forces with the Tista River. This older course supported a network of thriving ports and bustling trade routes, with merchant boats carrying silks, spices, and grains along a predictable and well-mapped waterway. Then, in 1787, the ground convulsed. A colossal earthquake, its epicenter likely in the Himalayas, tore through the region. The tremor itself was catastrophic, but its most lasting impact was on the rivers. It fractured the land, collapsing riverbanks and destabilizing the entire drainage system. This geological chaos was almost certainly followed by a monsoon of biblical proportions, a flood that exploited every new crack and weakness in the landscape. The combined force of the quake and the flood triggered what geologists call an avulsion. The Brahmaputra River did not simply erode a new bank. It performed a complete and sudden jump, abandoning its centuries-old eastern channel. In a dramatic act of capture, it seized the smaller Jamuna River to the west, diverting its entire colossal flow into this new, unprepared vessel. Imagine a garden hose suddenly being connected to a fire hydrant. The Jamuna swelled from a modest stream into the titanic, raging waterway we see on maps today. Its power multiplied 100-fold in a matter of months. The human consequences were immediate and devastating. The old trade routes were not just disrupted, they were erased. The ports that had grown wealthy on the eastern channel found their river gone, reduced to a sluggish, silting trickle. These once busy hubs became economic ghost towns, stranded in a backwater as the lifeblood of commerce surged west into the newly enlarged Jamuna. The river's new ambition had severed their connection to the world. Yet, in the ruthless logic of river rewiring, destruction in one place means creation in another. The same avulsion that drowned the old ports began depositing immense amounts of fertile silt downstream along the new course, building new land known as chars from the riverbed itself. This new, volatile landscape offered fresh opportunities for settlement and agriculture, but it came at the cost of everything that had come before. A single night of tectonic violence had not just moved water. It had flipped the entire economic and social map of the delta, proving once again that the ground beneath our feet is a temporary and treacherous foundation. Europe's longest river has been quietly swallowing its own coastline for thousands of years. The Volga carries a monumental burden of silt from the Russian heartland, depositing it in a vast, fan-shaped delta where it meets the Caspian Sea. This process, called progradation, is the river's slow, patient work of creation, building new land forward into the sea year after year. But for the civilizations that depended on its shores, this gradual advance was a relentless, invisible force that constantly rewrote the rules of trade and survival. Imagine a harbor town, a bustling center for Khazar merchants or Mongol traders, its docks crowded with ships loading furs and wax bound for Persia. A century later, that same town would find itself stranded. The shoreline, pushed forward by the Volga's unending sediment dump, had marched steadily eastward, leaving the port high and dry, separated from the water by kilometers of new marsh and farmland. The original harbor became a ghost, its stone quays buried under layers of fertile soil, a silent monument to a coastline that no longer existed. This was not a one-time event but a constant, slow-motion chase. Each generation had to abandon the old port and build a new one farther east, just to keep their access to the lifeblood of the sea. The economic strain was immense. Trade corridors that funneled goods from the forests of the north to the markets of Central Asia were in a state of perpetual adjustment. A caravan route that ended at a thriving port one decade might lead to a useless, landlocked village the next. The river's patient, inexorable work forced a continuous and costly migration of infrastructure, shaping the region's development not through a single catastrophe, but through 1,000 small retreats. The Volga did not flood its cities or change its course in a day. It simply extended its reach, and in doing so, it forced empires to keep moving, proving that even the slowest rewiring can dictate the fate of nations. The same river that gave life could also take it away with a casual turn. While the Sarasvati faded slowly, its mighty neighbor, the Indus, was prone to sudden and dramatic acts of betrayal. The great cities of the Indus Valley Civilization depended on this river's flow, but they also built their most vital trade hub directly in the path of its unpredictable nature. This was the port of Dabul, a bustling maritime gateway where goods from Mesopotamia were unloaded and the wealth of the interior was sent out to sea. For centuries, it thrived as a nexus of ancient global trade, a city whose fortunes were tied irrevocably to the river's mouth. Then the landscape itself began to move. The Indus River carries a colossal amount of silt down from the Himalayas, and as it reaches the sea, it drops this immense load, steadily building its delta forward. This slow progradation was a constant challenge, but Dabul's engineers likely fought a continuous battle to keep their channels dredged and open. They were prepared for a gradual change. What they could not withstand was a sudden, violent rewiring. Geological evidence points to a catalyst, perhaps a powerful earthquake that fractured the delta's plain or a super flood of biblical proportions that tore through the existing channels. This event did not just add more silt, it forced the entire river system to make a choice. The main flow of the Indus abandoned the delta lobe that fed Dabul's harbor, leaping sideways to find a steeper, more efficient path to the ocean dozens of miles to the west. The consequences for the port were immediate and final. Without the scouring flow of the main river, the approach to Dabul's harbor began to choke with sediment. The deep water channel that ocean-going ships required rapidly filled with sand and mud. transforming from a maritime highway into a shallow, impassable lagoon. Within a few generations, the docks where Mesopotamian merchants once haggled were left stranded far from the navigable water, watching over a sea of encroaching sand. The trade corridors that had made Dabel rich instantly evaporated, their focus shifting to whatever new outlet the Indus had carved for itself. The city was abandoned, its people scattered, and its stone walls were slowly buried by the desert, a silent victim of the river's restless wanderlust. One geological shrug was all it took to erase a gateway to the world. Even the most sophisticated water management can be undone by a river's whims. The Khmer Empire of Angkor was a hydraulic marvel, its survival tethered to a vast, intricate network of canals, reservoirs, and moats all connected to the pulse of the Tonle Sap Lake and the mighty Mekong River. This system was the empire's beating heart, moving not just water but the very lifeblood of its economy. Grain, timber, and precious stones flowed along these aquatic highways, fueling the construction of monumental temple complexes like Angkor Wat and sustaining a population of nearly 1 million people. The entire grand design, however, depended on a single, volatile source hundreds of miles away, the sprawling, ever-changing Mekong Delta. This delta is a landscape in perpetual motion, a flat, low-lying plain where the river fractures into a dozen shifting distributaries. Each year, monsoon floods carry immense loads of sediment down from the Tibetan Plateau, and each year, that sediment is dumped haphazardly at the river's mouth. The result is a constant, slow-motion wrestling match between land and water. Channels silt up, become blocked, and then, during a particularly powerful flood season, the pent-up water explodes through its banks, carving a brand new path to the sea and abandoning the old one entirely. A major shift in the primary channels here would have sent a shockwave upstream, altering the fundamental hydrology of the entire Mekong system. The careful balance of water flowing into the Tonle Sap, the giant lake that acted as the empire's natural reservoir, could have been disrupted. The canals around Angkor, engineered to precise gradients, might have seen their flow dwindle to a trickle or become choked with the very sediment that the river had redeposited upstream. While the empire's decline involved political strife and religious changes, imagine the slow, creeping strain on its logistics. Barges laden with stone for the next great temple find their canals too shallow to navigate. The intricate irrigation for the rice paddies that fed the capital begins to fail. The trade that financed the empire's grandeur would not have vanished in a day, but it would have begun to seek more reliable routes, following the Mekong's new, more vigorous distributaries. The great temples of Angkor never moved, but the vibrant economic network that built them did, slowly drifting away as the river redrew the map and left a magnificent capital stranded at the end of a dying aquatic road. Human ambition can build a wall that stops a river in its tracks. The Colorado River had spent millions of years performing a monumental task. It carved the Grand Canyon, a chasm of breathtaking scale, and then carried the very rock it had pulverized down to its final destination, the Gulf of California. There, it dumped this immense load of sediment, patiently building a vast, fertile delta that stretched for hundreds of square miles. This delta was a thriving ecological harbor, a labyrinth of wetlands and lagoons that supported an incredible diversity of life and sustained the Kokapa people for generations. Then, in the 20th century, we decided to rewire the river. The Hoover Dam, a stunning feat of engineering, was the first and most famous of many such barriers. It was built to tame floods, to generate power, and to store water for millions. But in achieving that, it performed a radical surgery on the river's natural cycle. The Colorado was no longer a powerful, sediment-laden giant. It became a controlled, clear trickle, its life-giving silt trapped forever behind concrete walls. The consequences for the delta were catastrophic and swift. Starved of both water and the sediment that built it, the land began to die, the wetlands shrank and vanished. The lagoons dried up into cracked, salt-encrusted plains. The vibrant ecological corridors that connected land and sea were severed. The fisheries that depended on the rich estuary waters collapsed, devastating local economies that had existed for centuries. The river's mouth, once a dynamic and growing piece of the continent, was left stranded by its own source. The harbor of life itself was abandoned. This was not a natural rewiring by flood or tectonic shift. This was a human-made event, a stark lesson that our mastery over a river can alter the very geography of its end, leaving a silent, shrinking delta as a monument to our power and its unintended cost. A river does not need to change its course to rewrite a city's fortune. The Thames has always followed the same broad valley, yet its relentless, tidal dance with silt has constantly shifted the very definition of a harbor. When Roman legions established Londinium, they chose the spot with a soldier's eye for logistics. It was the lowest practical bridging point on the river, but more importantly, it was a place where deep water access met solid ground. Their port thrived here, a bustling hub where galleys from across the empire unloaded fine pottery, wine, and marble directly into the heart of the settlement. This was a corridor of immense strategic value, a direct link from the continental heart of the empire to the wild frontier of Britannia. But a tidal river is a living, breathing entity. With each incoming tide, it pushed salt water upstream, slowing the current and allowing the countless particles of silt suspended in its waters to gently settle to the bottom. The Romans' master engineers understood this constant threat. They maintained their wooden quays and dredged their channels, holding back the encroaching mud through sheer force of will and organization. When the empire's grip on Britain weakened and that maintenance ceased, the river began to quietly reclaim its space. The process was imperceptible year by year, a slow motion burial. The original Roman harbor, once a scene of shouts and commerce, gradually filled with a soft, thick sludge. The waterfront advanced, pushing the effective shoreline farther and farther out. What was once a deep water dock became a shallow bank, then a muddy flat, and finally it was simply land buried under centuries of accumulated sediment. This slow rewiring forced the city's lifeblood to move. The trade corridor that had once terminated in the city's center could no longer reach its destination. Larger ships, the container vessels of their day, could no longer navigate the increasingly shallow approaches to Old Londinium. The port had to migrate, step by step, downstream toward the sea, chasing the deeper water it desperately needed. Over generations, the focus of maritime trade shifted eastward, from the Roman core to the medieval Queenhithe, and later to the sprawling complex of the Pool of London. This was not a choice made by merchants or kings, but a demand issued by the river itself. The relentless siltation of the Thames ultimately forged the landscape of the modern docklands, a district born from the necessity of building massive, artificial basins to recapture what the river had slowly stolen. The original Roman harbor now lies buried many meters below the modern city, a silent ghost whose abandonment set in motion the entire maritime geography of contemporary London. A river can nurture a civilization for centuries, then turn its back without a second thought. The Amu Darya, one of Central Asia's great waterways, has always held this power of life and death. For ages, it flowed north, pouring its precious cargo of snowmelt into the vast blue expanse of the Aral Sea. This partnership created a thriving world. On its shores, bustling ports like Moynak and Aralsk hummed with activity. Their fleets of fishing boats harvested a seemingly endless bounty from the sea's rich waters, and trade routes stretched across the water, connecting distant communities. The river was the sea's faithful heart, and the sea was the region's vibrant soul. But the Amu Darya had an ancient, forgotten allegiance. Centuries ago, it had occasionally flowed west, abandoning the Aral to pour its waters into the distant Caspian Sea. Then, in the 16th century, it shifted back, a natural rewiring that returned life to the Aral basin, an event possibly aided by the hand of canal builders from a long-lost khanate. For hundreds of years, that stability held. The modern era, however, brought a rewiring of an entirely different scale. In the mid-20th century, Soviet planners embarked on a colossal project to transform the desert into vast fields of cotton. They built a sprawling network of unlined canals, siphoning the Amu Darya's flow to irrigate this thirsty crop. This was not a sudden avulsion caused by a flood. It was a slow, deliberate diversion, a human-made event that methodically starved the sea. The consequences were as brutal as they were predictable. The Aral Sea began to shrink at a terrifying pace. The shoreline retreated mile by inexorable mile from the ports that depended on it. The fishing boats of Moynak and Aralsk were left stranded, first in shallow water, then on cracked, dry mud, and finally in the middle of a vast, toxic desert. The sea that had sustained them was simply gone. The trade corridor that moved fish and goods across the water vanished, replaced by a barren wasteland where salt and pesticide dust now blow on the wind. The Amu Darya's betrayal was complete, a stark reminder that the most powerful rewiring events are no longer always acts of nature, but can be the calculated and devastating decisions of humankind. South America's Paraná River once carved a winding, powerful path through the continent's heart. Its flow was a rhythm of seasons, a pulse of sediment and life that sustained communities for generations. Then, in the 1980s, humanity decided to change its tune. The Itaipu Dam was not a gradual shift or a natural disaster. It was a single, deliberate act of rewiring, a concrete plug inserted into the river's throat. The dam's construction did not just block water, it created an inland sea, one of the largest reservoirs on the planet. In a matter of years, a landscape defined by the river's flow was drowned under a new, artificial lake. The river's ancient corridors of trade and sustenance vanished beneath the silent, rising water. Traditional fishing grounds, the lifeblood of riverside villages, disappeared into the depths. Small ports and the informal trade routes that connected them were simply erased, their memory preserved only in the stories of those who watched the water climb. The river's ecology, a complex dance of migratory fish and nutrient-rich silt, was fundamentally broken. The dam acted as a wall, halting species that had traveled the Paraná's length for millennia and trapping the sediment that once fertilized floodplains far downstream. In an instant, the region's economic axis was flipped. The river was no longer a local highway for goods and food. It was harnessed, its power converted into a torrent of electricity flowing along new, high-voltage corridors to distant cities and even another country. Paraná's purpose was rewritten, from sustaining a local ecosystem to fueling an international grid. This was a human-made rewiring, a stark demonstration that our own ambition can reshape a landscape as decisively as any earthquake, leaving old harbors and old ways of life submerged under a new, imposed order. The Ganges River has been on a slow, unstoppable march eastward for centuries. This was not a sudden leap, but a patient, grinding crawl driven by two immense forces. The entire Bengal Basin, a colossal trough of sediment, is tectonically tilting downward to the east, like a giant, unseen hand slowly lowering one side of a table. At the same time, the river itself carries one of the world's heaviest loads of silt, a constant stream of sand and mud scoured from the high Himalayas. As it reaches the flat plains, it drops this immense burden, steadily building up its own bed and forcing its waters to seek lower ground. The river was not merely changing its path. It was gradually, irrevocably rewiring the entire drainage of the delta, and with it, the fate of every city that depended on its flow. On the western flank of this shifting system lay the port of Satgayon. For the medieval Bengal Sultanate, this city was a powerhouse of trade. Satgayon sat not on the main Ganges, but on the Saraswati River, a once vigorous distributary of the Hooghly that connected it directly to the sea. Its docks were crowded with deep-draft merchant ships carrying textiles, sugar, and rice to markets across the Indian Ocean. The wealth of an empire flowed through its harbors, a testament to the river's generous bounty. But as the main stem of the Ganges continued its eastern migration, abandoning the Hooghly branch for the new channel of the Padma River, the life began to drain from Satgayon's waterways. The Hooghly and its distributaries, including the Saraswati, were starved of the scouring, powerful flow that kept their channels deep and clear. Instead, they began to choke on the very sediment the great river had once carried past them. The process was relentless. Year after year, the navigable channel leading to Satgayon's harbor grew shallower. The large, ocean-going vessels that were the lifeblood of its economy found it increasingly difficult to approach. What was once a bustling maritime gateway became a labyrinth of shifting sandbars and muddy shallows. By the 17th century, the port was completely stranded, its magnificent harbor rendered inaccessible, a ghost town left behind by the water that gave it life. In the ruthless logic of river rewiring, the destruction of one port creates an opportunity for another. The economic vacuum left by Satgayon's demise demanded a new deep water harbor, and the English East India Company was watching. They established their foothold further downstream on the Hooghly at a collection of 3 small villages, a place that would become Calcutta. Here, closer to the sea, the river was still deep enough for their tall ships, even as the upper reaches silted shut. The rise of Calcutta as a colonial megacity was not merely a story of corporate ambition. It was a direct and almost inevitable consequence of the Ganges' slow tectonic migration. The river dictated the winner, shifting the primary trade corridor of the entire region and handing the keys to global commerce to a new power, all without ever changing its speed. The fates of cities are often sealed by a river's final, silent verdict. Along the ancient Silk Road, the great Darya River was a giver of life, its waters carving a fertile green ribbon through the arid heart of Central Asia. On its banks sat the magnificent city of Otrar, a cosmopolitan crossroads where languages and goods from China to the Mediterranean mingled in its bustling markets. This was more than a simple trading post. It was a harbor in a sea of sand, a vital node in the world's most famous overland trade corridor. Its wealth and power were entirely dependent on the Darya's predictable flow, which fed a vast and sophisticated network of irrigation canals that turned the desert into fields of plenty. But a perfect storm of human and natural forces was gathering. A shift in climate patterns began to reduce the river's overall flow, a slow onset drought that strained the entire region. Then came the spark of human conflict. The city's leaders made a catastrophic decision, executing a trade envoy of Genghis Khan. The Mongol response was swift and merciless, and in the brutal invasion that followed, the intricate system of canals that sustained Otrar was likely deliberately targeted for destruction. This was the final blow. The Darya, its waters already diminished, found its man-made pathways shattered. With the canals broken, the river's flow was no longer guided. It began to wander across the flat, featureless plain, seeking a new, easier path and gradually shifting its main channel away from the city walls. The consequences were absolute. The agricultural lands that fed Otrar's population withered and died. Without water, there was no food. Without food, there were no people. And without a reliable water source, the great caravans of the Silk Road simply stopped coming. They found new routes bypassing the dying city entirely. The harbor on the sand was left stranded. Within generations, Otrar was empty, its grand buildings slowly surrendering to the encroaching desert sands, a ghost of a metropolis buried by a river's betrayal and the devastating cost of war. 16 events into our journey, we arrive at a choke point that held prehistoric Europe in its grip. The Danube River was the superhighway of its age, a watery path along which the first farmers, the first metalworkers, and the very ideas of civilization traveled west. And at its heart lay the Iron Gate, a narrow, majestic gorge carved between the Carpathian and Balkan mountains. This was not just a scenic wonder, it was a geological valve controlling all movement. The cultures that clustered along its shores, like the famed Lepenski Vir with its strange fish god sculptures, lived in the shadow of this valve, their entire world defined by the river's flow. But the mountains here are restless. Evidence locked in the rock tells us of colossal landslides, of earthquakes that shook the very cliffs. A single, massive rockslide could have done the unthinkable, tumbling enough stone and earth into the narrow gorge to act as a colossal plug. The river would have backed up instantly, its power checked. Behind this natural dam, a vast lake would have begun to form, swallowing the valleys upstream, drowning the very settlements that had thrived there for generations. Imagine the scene for those who survived the initial collapse, watching the waters rise day by day, submerging their homes and their ancestral fishing grounds under a silent, expanding inland sea. Their world was literally being drowned from below. Then came the burst. Water always wins. The earthen dam, saturated and unstable, would eventually fail. And when it did, it would not be a simple flood. It would be a wall of water and pulverized rock exploding through the gorge with the force of a geological bomb. This deluge would have scoured the Danube's path clean, ripping through the downstream plains with unimaginable violence. Every riverside village, every trading post, every carefully maintained canoe landing in its path would have been erased in a single, furious day. The established corridors of trade and migration, the invisible networks that moved obsidian for tools and spondylus shells for jewelry, were not just disrupted. They were severed, wiped from the map as if they had never existed. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would have been forced to start over, their collective memory reset by the river's rage. The human geography of the entire Balkans was rewritten in a flash flood. A sudden and brutal reminder that even the most stable-looking corridors of human connection are just temporary arrangements, waiting for the mountain to decide otherwise. Gold can create a fortune, but only a river can decide who gets to keep it. The Fraser River of British Columbia was a liquid road to riches during the 1858 gold rush, carrying thousands of hopeful prospectors deep into its canyon heart. Their entire world was the riverbed and its gravel bars, where a single pan could reveal a life-changing nugget. This was a trade corridor in its rawest form, moving not spices or silk, but dreams of instant wealth, all dictated by the river's flow. Then came the spring of 1861. A brutal winter's worth of snow melted in the mountains, sending a colossal surge of water known as a freshet roaring down the canyon. This was not a gentle rise in the water level. It was a churning, brown wall of liquid rock that tore through the narrow gorge, scouring the riverbed down to its bones. The makeshift mining towns perched on the banks were simply erased. their flimsy wooden structures splintered and washed away in an afternoon. The prospectors' work of an entire season, the sluice boxes and hand-dug claims, vanished under the torrent. But the river was not just destroying, it was redistributing. The flood's immense power acted like a giant's hand, violently shuffling the entire deck of gold-laden gravel. It stripped ancient deposits from one stretch of the river and dumped them unceremoniously onto another. A claim that had been painstakingly worked for months might be left barren, its gold ripped away and carried downstream. Meanwhile, a previously worthless sandbar could be transformed overnight into the richest spot in the canyon, its gravel now packed with treasure dredged from somewhere else entirely. This was a rewiring of wealth itself. The economic map of the gold rush was not just altered, it was flipped upside down in the span of a single, violent day. Men who were paupers at sunrise could find themselves standing on a newfound fortune by the next dawn, while established mining companies saw their investments literally wash away. The Fraser River demonstrated a brutal, elemental truth. It held the ultimate authority over the economy it had created, capable of granting riches or imposing ruin with nothing more than a change in its current. Even the border between empires was never truly fixed, not when it was written in water. The Tigris and Euphrates, the legendary twins of Mesopotamia, do not simply run to the sea. They embrace in a final confluence, merging their flows to create the Shatt al-Arab, a single waterway that serves as the final artery to the Persian Gulf. Yet this meeting point has always been a wanderer. Over the centuries, the exact spot where the two rivers became one has drifted north and south, a slow migration dictated by the relentless accumulation of silt and the raw power of occasional floods. This was far more than a geographical curiosity. The river was the border. A shift of even a few miles in the confluence could transfer vast tracts of land from one kingdom to another, redrawing international boundaries with nothing more than a change in the mud. The political map of the entire region could be quietly, passively, rewritten by the rivers themselves. The economic consequences were just as profound. As the Shatt al-Arab's channel shifted, so did its deep water access. A port city on one bank, thriving with deep draft trading vessels, could find its side of the river suddenly silting up, becoming a shallow backwater. At the same moment, the opposite bank might be scoured clean, its waterfront transformed into the new premier harbor for all maritime trade. This is the fate that befell the great Parthian port of Charax-Spasinu. Founded as a major gateway linking the Silk Road to the Indian Ocean, its docks were once piled high with goods from Rome and India, but the twin rivers were never finished with their work. The distributaries that connected Charax to the main channel of the Shatt al-Arab gradually choked with sediment, its lifeline to the sea slowly strangling. The city that was built to command the confluence found itself abandoned by the very waters that gave it purpose, left stranded inland as the rivers chose a new path to the Gulf. The trade corridors of Mesopotamia, the very first in human history, were not carved in stone. They were drawn in silt, and they could be erased just as easily by the next flood, the next season of deposition, in the slow, patient dance of the twin rivers. The story of the Cahora Bassa Dam is a modern chapter in our ancient saga of river rewiring, a deliberate act of redirection with profound human costs. In the early 1970s, on the mighty Zambezi River in Mozambique, engineers erected a colossal wall of concrete. The Cahora Bassa Dam was built to harness the river's power to generate electricity for a burgeoning nation. But to create the immense reservoir required, the river had to be stopped in its tracks. The valley behind the dam began to fill, slowly and inexorably, with a rising tide that showed no mercy. This was not a natural flood. It was a calculated, human-made deluge. The waters submerged the fertile Zambezi Valley, a landscape that had sustained communities for countless generations. Riverbanks that for centuries had been bustling hubs of local commerce were swallowed whole. The natural harbors where fishermen launched their boats and traders met to barter goods vanished into the deepening blue. Ancient footpaths and water-based trade routes, the organic corridors that moved salt, cloth, and news between villages, were erased from the map, now lying silent under dozens of meters of water. In their place, the dam created a new, artificial corridor. The vast surface of Lake Cahora Bassa became a highway for large barges and modern transport, a new economic logic imposed from above. Yet this new corridor could never replace what was lost. The harbors of a traditional way of life, the intimate knowledge of the river's moods and bounty, were left stranded not by receding water, but by its deliberate, permanent rise. The river was rewired to power distant cities, but in the process, it flipped the social and economic world of the valley upside down, trading a living, breathing landscape for a placid reservoir and leaving the ghosts of communities to linger beneath the waves. A river can redraw the very line between nations with a single, muddy shrug. The Rio Grande was designated as a fixed political boundary, a clean line on a map separating the United States from Mexico. But the river itself had never agreed to this role. It was a living, meandering entity, constantly carving wide loops across its floodplain. During major floods, its swirling currents would grow impatient with these long, lazy bends. The water would slice directly across the narrow neck of a loop, abandoning the old channel entirely and leaving it as a dry, crescent-shaped scar on the landscape. This natural process, known as a cut-off, became a source of international conflict. In the late 19th century, a particularly dramatic shift occurred south of El Paso. The river jumped its banks during a flood and established a new channel, moving decisively southward. Overnight, this act of geological whimsy transferred hundreds of acres of land from Mexico to the United States. The map had been rewritten not by diplomats but by water. This was the heart of the Chamizal dispute. The river's new path did not just move dirt, it rewired lives and law. Mexican citizens who went to sleep in their own country woke up to find their homes and farms suddenly on the northern side of the border, subject to a new government, new taxes, and new laws. The established corridors of local trade and daily life were severed. A farmer's well-worn path to a market now crossed an international frontier. A community was literally split in two by the river's new course. For decades, this fluid border created a zone of uncertainty, a place where human notions of sovereignty were held hostage to the river's restless nature. It took a formal treaty signed in 1963 to finally resolve the issue, with the United States agreeing to return most of the lost land to Mexico. Engineers then stepped in to cement the river's place, confining it within a concrete channel to prevent it from changing its mind again. The Chamizal dispute stands as a powerful testament to a simple, humbling truth. Our political lines are temporary sketches, forever vulnerable to being erased and redrawn by the enduring power of a river's flow. A river's redirection does not always mean loss. In the Balkans, the Neretva River's delta has always been a work in progress, its many fingers constantly reshaped by seasonal floods and the slow, patient accumulation of silt. Then, in the medieval period, the river's own logic shifted. A natural dam of fallen trees and sediment, or perhaps a collapse within the porous karst bedrock, blocked a key distributary. The water, with nowhere else to go, began to spill across a low-lying karst field, an area that had once been firm, productive ground. It did not simply flood the land. It permanently drowned it, creating or vastly expanding the vast labyrinthine wetlands known as the Hutovo Blato. This was not a violent, overnight catastrophe, but a slow, creeping transformation. Farmers who had tilled the same soil for generations watched as their fields vanished beneath a rising, stagnant mirror. The overland trade routes that had forded this area, paths used by merchants carrying goods from the coast to the interior, were severed. The solid ground became a treacherous maze of channels and sinking islands, impassable for carts and caravans, yet the river's rewiring did not create a void. It demanded a new way of life. The economic focus of the region pivoted entirely. Where wheat once grew, reed beds flourished. The people traded their plows for boats and their nets. The very corridors of commerce changed, shifting from dusty trails to watery highways. Small, hidden harbors for flat-bottomed skiffs replaced roadside inns. The trade in grain and livestock was supplanted by a bustling economy of fish, waterfowl, and the rich resources of the marsh itself. The Hutovo Blato stands as a powerful reminder that a river's change of heart is not always an ending. It can be a brutal, messy, and yet profoundly creative act, forging an entirely new ecosystem and flipping the human world from a culture of the land to a culture of the water, all within the same stretch of earth. A capital city can watch its own front door slowly vanish under mud. The Red River of Vietnam has always been a volatile neighbor to Hanoi, once known as Thang Long. Born in the high mountains of Yunnan, it races down a steep gradient, gathering immense power before it hits the flat plains of the capital. Each summer monsoon transforms this river from a life-giver into a brown, churning monster, its waters swollen with an unimaginable load of silt. For centuries, the people here built and rebuilt immense earthen dikes, a fragile human wall against the river's rage. Historical chronicles are filled with accounts of these barriers failing, of catastrophic floods that drowned the countryside and rewrote the local map overnight. Then, in the 17th century, the river delivered its most consequential blow. A colossal flood, or perhaps a series of them, did not merely overtop the dikes. It tore through them with such force that it triggered a full avulsion. The main channel of the Red River abandoned its established course, leaping sideways to find a new, steeper path to the sea. The old riverbed, which had served as the primary harbor for the royal capital of Thang Long, was left to die. This harbor, situated near what is now the Long Bayen Bridge, was the vibrant heart of the kingdom's trade. It was where merchant junks from China and beyond would dock, unloading porcelain and silk and loading the kingdom's own treasures. But once the river's main flow deserted it, the scouring current that kept the channel deep was gone. The relentless silt that the Red River carried now had nowhere to go but to settle, quietly and inexorably, into the abandoned harbor. Within a few decades, the deep water port that had welcomed ocean-going vessels was transformed. It became a shallow, muddy backwater, completely impassable for the ships that were the city's economic lifeblood. The trade corridor into the capital was physically severed. The royal court and the powerful merchant guilds had no choice. They were forced to abandon the old port and develop entirely new facilities miles downstream, closer to the river's new, active mouth. This was not a simple renovation. It was a complete relocation of the city's economic heart. The bustling markets, the customs houses, the warehouses full of goods, all had to migrate to follow the water. The old harbor, once the proud gateway to a capital, was left as a silted-up ghost, a historical footnote in the story of a city that had to move its front door because the river decided to rearrange the furniture. Gold fever meant nothing without the river's consent. In the frozen north, the Yukon was not just a route to the Klondike's riches, it was the source of the gamble itself. This was a braided giant, a sprawling network of channels separated by countless gravel bars, and its entire being was in constant, restless motion. Each spring, the breakup was not a gentle thaw but a geological event. As the winter's ice shattered, it released a pent-up torrent of water that tore through the valley with the force of a locomotive. This annual flood did not merely raise the water level. It performed a complete redesign of the river's bed, scouring tons of gravel from one stretch and dumping it unceremoniously onto another. For the thousands of miners who staked their lives on claims along the banks, this was the ultimate uncertainty. Their entire world was a lottery drawn by the current. A claim that had yielded only worthless rock one season could, after a single spring flood, be transformed into the richest spot on the river. The gold, heavier than the surrounding gravel, would sink during the flood, only to be buried under fresh layers of sediment as the water slowed. A miner might arrive at his property to find a fortune waiting, literally laid at his feet by the river's hand. But the reverse was just as common and far more devastating. A productive claim that had funded a camp for months could be stripped bare overnight, its wealth ripped away and deposited miles downstream, leaving behind nothing but barren stone. The economic corridor of the gold rush was not a fixed line on a map. It was a living, shifting tapestry of potential, rewired each spring. This forced a frantic migration, a desperate chase as miners abandoned played-out bars and rushed to the new hotspots the river had created. Their fortunes did not rise and fall with the price of gold, but with the Yukon's endless, indifferent reworking of its own gravelly bones. The very silt that built Iraq's delta now threatens to choke its primary gateway to the world. For the modern port of Basra, the Shatt al-Arab waterway is both its reason for being and its slow-moving nemesis. This confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates carries the legacy of entire mountains, pulverized into fine particles and washed down to the sea. Every day, this immense load of sediment settles in the calm, tidal stretches of the river, silently accumulating on the bottom and relentlessly raising the riverbed. For centuries, this was a manageable, natural process. But in the 20th century, the scale of global trade changed everything. The arrival of massive oil tankers and deep draft container ships demanded channels of a depth that nature never intended to provide here. The port of Basra found itself in a desperate, expensive race against the river itself. The dredging operations required to keep the shipping lane open became a monumental and ceaseless task, a financial drain where millions were spent just to maintain the status quo, to hold back the inevitable silting for another season. This was a slow-burn rewiring event, one that did not happen overnight but posed an existential threat to Iraq's entire maritime economy. How do you run a modern nation when your main trade corridor is actively trying to close itself? The answer was a fundamental strategic pivot. The country began investing billions in alternatives designed to bypass the rebellious river altogether. Vast networks of pipelines were laid to carry oil overland to more reliable ports. Ambitious plans were drawn up to develop the Al-Faw Peninsula, building entirely new deep-water terminals right on the open coast where the silt-laden river could no longer reach. The silent, patient work of sedimentation had forced a sovereign nation to reconsider its entire geographical identity, proving that a river's most powerful act of rebellion is not always a flood, but a quiet, constant filling in that can strand a nation's ambitions in the mud. The Godavari River's sprawling delta was once a canvas for one of India's greatest ports. Nalasopara thrived as a cosmopolitan gateway, a place where Roman coins mingled with Buddhist relics and spices from the interior were loaded onto ships bound for the Mediterranean. Its name appears in Greco-Roman logs and ancient Buddhist scriptures, a testament to its pivotal role in a global trade network that linked the Indian subcontinent to the Roman Empire. This was not a minor trading post, but a vibrant international harbor, a crucial node where wealth and ideas converged. Yet the very landscape that nurtured this hub was already shifting beneath its stone quays. The Godavari, carrying immense loads of silt from the Deccan Plateau, was steadily building its delta forward into the sea. This natural process of land building was compounded by a more dramatic force. Geological evidence points to a gradual coastal uplift, likely driven by the same seismic pressures that shape the Western Ghats. This upward tilt of the coastline, almost imperceptible over a human lifetime, acted like a tray being slowly raised at one end. The creeks and inlets that served as Nolla Sapara's navigable arteries began to drain. The water simply could not flow as freely into a harbor that was being lifted higher. At the same time, the Godavara's relentless sediment delivery continued. Silt that once washed out to sea now began to accumulate in these sluggish, raised waterways. The harbor's deep water channel, once scoured by strong tidal currents, began to choke. What was a bustling maritime corridor became a shallow lagoon, then a silted-in creek, and finally a marsh. The great ships of the Roman trade could no longer reach the docks. The trade corridors that for centuries had funneled goods through Nolla Sapara were instantly severed. The economic lifeblood of the city ceased to flow. Merchants, ship captains, and artisans had no choice but to move on, following the deep water to emerging ports elsewhere along the coast. Nolla Sapara did not burn or fall to an invader. It was simply stranded by a river's change of heart and a coastline's slow rise, its grandeur fading into the obscurity of a small town, its glorious past buried under layers of mud and memory. The legend of El Dorado was a golden fever that consumed entire expeditions. Conquistadors hacked through jungles and scaled mountains, driven by tales of a king who coated his body in gold dust and washed it away in a sacred lake. They never found that city of unimaginable wealth, but the truth may be even more compelling. El Dorado was likely not a single place, but a powerful, gold-rich chiefdom, a real political center that controlled trade across the Orinoco River basin. This vast network of waterways was its superhighway, moving not just goods but power and information. Then the rivers rewired. A major avulsion, a sudden jump in the river's course, could have struck the very heart of this chiefdom. Imagine a flood of biblical proportions, not just rising water, but the river itself abandoning its channel and carving a new one directly through the center of power. The capital, the trade hubs, the agricultural lands, all could have been submerged under a new, permanent inland sea or left stranded in a desolate, water-starved backwater. The trade corridors that defined its influence were not just disrupted, they were erased, flipped from vibrant economic pathways into impassable swamps or barren, dried-up riverbeds. The chiefdom's political and economic unity would have shattered instantly, survivors scattered, their complex society collapsing into isolated villages. The knowledge of its location, once common to traders navigating the river highways, faded into fragmented, half-remembered stories. Within a few generations, the powerful center was gone, its memory transforming from a real place into a shimmering, unattainable myth. The Orinoco River did not simply destroy a city. It performed the ultimate act of concealment, using its own raw power to hide one of history's most sought-after treasures, leaving behind only a golden legend and a corridor of exploration that led, for centuries, to a dead end. A continent away, another river was forced into a permanent detour. Australia's mighty Murray River once flowed along a very different path, a course that was abruptly cancelled by a geological ultimatum. Deep in the past, the Cadal Fault, a massive fracture in the Earth's crust, shuddered to life. This was not a quick tremor but a slow, colossal heave, pushing a long ridge of land directly across the river's chosen route. The Murray, a powerful and established waterway, suddenly found its way to the sea completely blocked by this new wall of earth and rock. It had no choice but to surrender to the new topography. Hemmed in by the rising land, the river turned south, abandoning its ancestral channel and scouring out an entirely new path to the ocean. In its wake, it left a complex legacy, a rewired system that created the Edward River, an anabranch that runs parallel to the main Murray for over 200 miles. This was not a seasonal flood or a temporary diversion. This was a permanent replumbing of the entire basin. The consequences for the landscape were absolute. Vast ancient floodplains that had been regularly nourished by the river's flow were suddenly left high and dry, their soils beginning a long, slow fade into desert. At the same time, new wetlands and fertile plains were born along the river's new southern route, a sudden bounty of life emerging from geological chaos. For the indigenous nations who had lived with the river for millennia, this event would have been a world-altering catastrophe. Their entire mental map of the continent's greatest aquatic highway was rendered obsolete overnight. The established corridors for trade, travel, and communication, routes that moved precious stones, ochre, and tools across vast distances, were severed. Sacred sites connected to the old river course were left stranded, their meaning transformed as the water retreated. The intricate knowledge of where to find food, where to cross, and where to meet other clans was suddenly invalid. This forced a complete cultural and economic reset, a monumental task of remapping not just the land, but their entire relationship with it. A single geological shrug had not just moved water. It had rewritten the rules of survival and connection for an entire continent. The Seine River did not always embrace the iconic islands at its heart. Long before Paris was a name on any map, this waterway was a sprawling, braided beast, its currents divided into a dozen shifting channels that wove through a wide, wet basin. This was a landscape of uncertainty, of sandbars that appeared and vanished with each flood, and waterways that offered no stable ground for a lasting settlement. Trade along such a river was a seasonal gamble, with cargo boats navigating a maze that could change completely after a single storm. Then, over millennia, the river began to rewiring itself. Each flood deposited a little more silt along the banks, building up natural levees that slowly, patiently, pushed the unruly channels toward one another. The weaker distributaries silted up and were abandoned, while the stronger currents merged and deepened. This was the river performing its own act of urban planning, consolidating its flow, and in the process, constructing the solid, defensible mounds of the Isle de la Cité and the Isle Saint Louis. Where there was once a treacherous wetland, the Seine now presented a perfect strategic gift. These new islands were natural fortresses, surrounded by water yet centrally located on the main navigable channel. They offered a safe harbor for boats and a defensible home for the Parisii tribe, whose settlement would one day become a global capital. The river's gradual rewiring did not just change its course. It built the very foundation upon which a crossroads of trade and power could rise, flipping the region from an impassable marsh into the undeniable heart of a nation. The Yangtze River met its match in a wall of concrete. The Three Gorges Dam stands as humanity's most ambitious attempt to command a continental waterway, a complete and intentional rewiring of a river's very nature. For centuries, the Yangtze's seasonal flood pulse was a force of both creation and destruction, scouring its channel and depositing fertile silt across its plains. The dam did not just moderate these floods, it eliminated the pulse itself, transforming the wild river into a managed reservoir. This control brought immense benefits, creating a deep, placid channel that allowed massive cargo ships to sail deep into China's interior, flipping the economic potential of upstream cities almost overnight. But the river fought back with a cascade of unintended consequences. The very sediment that once fertilized floodplains and built the delta is now trapped behind the dam, over 1 billion tons of it settling into the still waters of the reservoir each year. Downstream, the river runs hungry. Stripped of its silt, its clearer, more energetic waters began to scour the riverbed and its banks, eroding the very foundations of the levees built to contain it. This hunger reaches all the way to the sea. The Great Yangtze Delta, which includes the megacity of Shanghai, is no longer being replenished. Instead, it is now actively eroding, its land slowly sinking and retreating as the ocean claims back what the river no longer defends. The trade corridor that the dam enhanced upstream is now threatened at its terminus. The river's chemistry has been altered, its temperature changed, and its delivery of vital nutrients to the East China Sea has been severed. The rich fisheries that once thrived on this seasonal banquet have collapsed, an ecological corridor sacrificed for an industrial one. This is the ultimate modern bargain. We flipped the switch, gaining unprecedented flood control, power, and navigation. But in doing so, we traded the long-term stability of a coastline and an ecosystem for the immediate needs of an economy. The Three Gorges Dam is a monument to our power to rewire a river and a permanent reminder of the debt that such power incurs. The Nile's own children were locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance. Across its vast delta, the river split into two main arteries, the Rosetta and the Damietta branches, and their balance of power was never fixed. For centuries, the river's immense load of silt dictated a ruthless, cyclical drama. When the Rosetta branch captured a greater share of the Nile's flow, its current grew strong and vigorous. This powerful stream scoured its channel deep and carried its fertile mud far out to sea, building the Rosetta Delta lobe steadily forward into the Mediterranean. Ports like Rashid, situated at this active mouth, thrived. Their harbors remained deep and accessible, their docks crowded with merchant ships carrying grain and papyrus to the wider world. They were the new maritime gateways, the primary corridors for all the wealth of the Nile Valley. But this golden age was always temporary. The river's favor was fickle. A major flood, a collapse of a riverbank, or simply the relentless accumulation of sediment could trigger a shift. The main flow would swing back toward the Damietta branch. Instantly, the Rosetta's strength would wane. Without a strong current to flush it out, its mouth would begin to choke on the very silt it had once carried so proudly. The harbor at Rashid would slowly transform. The deep water channel that welcomed deep draft vessels would become a labyrinth of sandbars and shallows. Within a few generations, the bustling port could find itself stranded, a backwater watching as the economic life of Egypt migrated to the now vigorous Damietta and its thriving ports. This was not a change in policy or a result of war. It was the river itself, endlessly rewiring its own endpoints, deciding which city would control the lucrative trade between the Mediterranean and the heart of an ancient civilization. The rise and fall of these delta ports was a direct reflection of the Nile's internal competition, a slow-motion battle between its own distributaries that constantly redrew the map of commerce and power. The Andes Mountains were not always the colossal barrier we see today. In a much older world, the Amazon River ran in the opposite direction, a westward flowing giant that emptied into a vast, shallow sea covering the heart of South America. This was the continent's original drainage, a system that functioned for millions of years. Then, the ground itself began to revolt. The slow, inexorable collision of tectonic plates pushed the Andes skyward, a geological upheaval that acted like a continent-sized hand slowly closing a valve. The river's westward path was systematically choked off, blocked by this new, rising wall of rock. With its escape route to the Pacific severed, the waters had nowhere to go but back. The entire river system reversed its flow, a staggering act of continental rewiring. The Amazon began carving a violent, desperate path east, cutting through the ancient landscape to find a new outlet in the Atlantic Ocean. This was not a simple change of course. It was the planet hitting the ultimate reset button on an entire continent's plumbing. The consequences were as profound as they were beautiful. The basin that once held an inland sea was now flooded with fresh water, creating a vast, shallow wetland. This new, waterlogged world became the ultimate biological harbor, a refuge and a cradle for life on an unimaginable scale. The conditions were perfect for the explosion of biodiversity we now call the Amazon rainforest. Every tree, every vine, every unique creature in that immense jungle exists because a river was forced to turn around. The trade corridors it flipped were not of gold or silk, but of species themselves, creating the most vital biological exchange on the planet, all from the ghost of a sea that a mountain range erased. A Tsar's obsession with water could redraw the map of an entire continent. Peter the Great looked at the vast expanse of Russia and saw a problem of flow. The mighty Volga River emptied into the landlocked Caspian Sea, while the Don River offered a path to the Azov Sea and the coveted warm water ports of the Black Sea. Between them lay a narrow strip of land, a frustrating geographical barrier separating two great basins. His vision was to carve a canal through this isthmus, to rewire the nation's plumbing with the sheer force of human will. He saw a future where Russian ships could move from the heart of Asia to the doorstep of Europe without ever braving the open ocean, a trade corridor that would leapfrog over geography itself. Though his engineers could not complete the task in the 18th century, the dream itself reveals a profound truth. Humanity had moved from fearing river rewiring to actively planning its own. The ambition to connect, to shortcut, to flip the natural order for economic gain had become a driving force in history. That ambition was finally realized in the 1950s with the completion of the Volga-Don Canal. This was not a slow avulsion or a tectonic shift. It was a deliberate, surgical cut, a human-made event that permanently linked two river systems that nature had kept separate. The moment the canal gates opened, the trade corridors of southern Russia were instantly and artificially flipped. Ships that once had to travel thousands of miles around continents could now make a direct inland journey. The Caspian Sea was no longer a hydrological dead end. It was suddenly connected to the global shipping lanes of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Grain from the Volga plains could reach international markets faster. Oil from the Caspian had a new, secure route to the world. This human-made rewiring created an entirely new economic artery, proving that our desire to command the flow of commerce is as powerful as any flood or earthquake. The ghost of Peter's dream became a concrete reality, a permanent reminder that we are now among the forces that can redraw the map overnight. Roman engineers would not recognize the river their ships once sailed. Hispalis, the vibrant port we now call Seville, was a jewel of imperial logistics, a deep-water harbor where galleys from across the Mediterranean unloaded their cargoes far inland. The Guadalquivir River was its wide, welcoming artery, a liquid road that connected the Iberian interior directly to the sea. For centuries, this corridor functioned flawlessly, its currents strong enough to keep the channel clear for the deep-draft vessels of the Roman world. But a slow, insidious change was already underway. Upstream, deforestation and farming loosened the soil, and with every rain, countless grains of silt began their long, patient journey toward the sea. The river, once a scouring force, became a conveyor belt for its own imprisonment. It carried the very material that would, grain by grain, year by year, fill its own bed. This was a rewiring event measured not in days but in decades, a silent transformation that no single generation might fully perceive. The deep channel gradually became a shallow trough. The Roman harbor, built for a certain depth, found the water slowly retreating from its stone quays. By the time the age of exploration dawned, the paradox was complete. Seville was named the official administrative center for all trade with the New World, the place where contracts were signed and royal fiefs were collected. Yet the great caravels and galleons returning from the Americas, their hulls laden with Aztec gold and Inca silver, could no longer reach the city. The river had become too shallow, its bed too soft for these deep-draft ocean giants. The glorious wealth of the Indies had to stop dozens of miles short of its official destination. The physical act of trade, the loading and unloading that is the lifeblood of any port, was forced to move. It leapfrogged downstream to Sanlúcar de Barrameda at the river's mouth, and then to the open coastal harbor of Cadiz. The administrative heart remained in Seville, but the economic body had been severed and relocated by the river's slow, stubborn work. The Guadalquivir did not flood the city or change its course in a dramatic leap. It performed a far more subtle act of rebellion, simply sitting up its own bed until the great ships could no longer call, silently shifting the center of maritime gravity and leaving a legendary port stranded by the very silt that had once built its fertile plains. A river's fury can build a prison with its own current. The Congo descends from the Central African plateau not as a gentle ramp, but as a crashing, thunderous staircase. For nearly 200 miles, its lower reach is a chaos of white water known as the Livingstone Falls, a relentless series of cataracts and rapids that no ocean-going ship could ever hope to conquer. This was not a river that changed its path. It was a river that stood its ground, an immovable geographic fact that rewired human destiny by refusing to be tamed. Its unyielding nature created a stark divide, separating the deep, navigable heart of the continent from the Atlantic coast. To move anything of scale from one side to the other, people had no choice but to go around. They carved portage routes, grueling overland paths where canoes and goods were carried on human shoulders, skirting the river's impassable rage. In a different time, these might have been simple corridors of local trade. But history arrived with a terrible purpose. When the transatlantic slave trade engulfed the region, the river's stubborn geography was perverted into a tool of horror. Those same bypass trails, the only way around the water's wrath, became brutally efficient funnels. Captured individuals, torn from their homes upstream, were force marched along these paths, navigating the very obstacle that the ocean could not. The river itself had designed the corridor, a tragic and inescapable route from the navigable interior directly to the waiting slave ships anchored in the calm coastal waters. The Congo did not shift its bed or silt up a harbor. Its power was in its permanent, roaring presence, a natural barricade that forced human cruelty onto a specific, devastating path, forever shaping the brutal logic of a trade built on suffering. 34 stories of rivers rewriting our world reveal a deep and unsettling order. Tectonic uplift stands out as the ultimate architect, a slow hand that tilts continents and redirects the flow of entire civilizations. It is the master switch that can lock a river in place or force it to find a new sea. Then come the catastrophic floods, the swift executioners of change that carve new canyons in a single season and make mockeries of our most careful maps. And always there is sedimentation, the patient sculptor that works grain by grain, quietly filling harbors and building new land until the water has no choice but to spill elsewhere. We see a clear and brutal logic at play. Civilizations that anchor themselves to the most dynamic landscapes, the sprawling deltas and restless floodplains, build their houses on the most fertile, yet most fragile ground. Their greatness is often borrowed, and the repayment can be swift and absolute. In stark contrast, the societies that learn to read the river's moods, that remain nimble and ready to move their ports or shift their trade, are the ones that endure. They understand that the river is a partner, not a servant. Woven through every one of these events is the haunting image of the harbor left behind. It is the ghost of a former economy, a collection of silent stones that once echoed with the shouts of merchants and the creak of ships. These places are monuments to a river's fidelity that was ultimately broken, a powerful reminder that the waters that give life can just as easily revoke it. These 34 rewiring events teach us a profound humility. They show us that our bustling economic corridors, our global supply chains and capital cities, are often nothing more than temporary agreements with a force that has no memory of its past paths. The river does not care about the empire it fed yesterday. It only follows the relentless physics of gravity and flow, and our world is constantly being reshaped in its wake. From the vanished Sarasvati to the controlled Mississippi, this journey through 34 river rewiring events is ultimately a mirror held up to our own civilization. It is a story of our ambition to build empires on silt, our desperate adaptation when the water retreats, and the abrupt, humbling changes that remind us who is truly in charge. These are not just tales of lost cities, but of the very fabric of trade, power, and human connection being torn and rewoven by the planet's restless energy. The ground we so confidently pave and the rivers we so boldly bridge are not passive stages for our drama. They are active, dynamic participants in a system that can flip the entire script of our world overnight. The silent stones of a stranded harbor are more than archaeological curiosities. They are stark warnings etched in rock and mud. They speak of economies that vanished when the water did, of power that evaporated with the current. As we now face a future of our own making, with climate change reshaping coastlines and intensifying the very floods we have explored, this history is not a distant curiosity. It is an essential guide. It teaches us that our greatest security lies not in trying to fully control these forces, but in building with a resilience that respects them, in designing our corridors of commerce with the humility to know they are temporary. Let these stories be a compass for that future. Thank you for exploring these profound historical mysteries with us. If this journey down the shifting paths of history captivated you, please subscribe for more deep dives into the past. We would love to hear which of these 34 river events amazed you the most, so share your thoughts in the comments.